Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon and to enjoy this beautiful country and this beautiful resort with you. My name is Ms. Ikponwosa Ero, as you can see on the nameplate. I tried to pretend I'm Itoke, but it didn't work. I'm actually from Nigeria, and I have albinism myself. The reason why my mandate was created at the United Nations Human Rights Council 3 years ago in 2015 was to respond to particular atrocities against this people group, that is people with albinism, namely physical attacks and hunting down of people with albinism for the purposes of harvesting their body parts, cutting them off with knives and machetes, and selling them on the black market. This is still happening. The body parts are allegedly, according to the Red Cross, valued on the black market for thousands of US dollars. One arm, $2,000 US. Full body, $75,000 US. This has been happening since the last 10 years, so it's a decade-long problem. Unfortunately, most of these cases are coming from my own region, Sub-Saharan Africa. Hundreds of cases reported in 28 countries. Since these cases came up and were brought to light in the international scene and this mandate was created, I took on the role not only to bring an end to these atrocities and to go at the root causes, which are actually many factors, including poverty, ignorance on what albinism is, and witchcraft. Witchcraft is a huge factor. When you have some of these elements, and unfortunately they line up in some very atrocious ways, it's very difficult to change mindsets in believing in witchcraft. And in this case in particular, the belief that the body parts have efficacy when you use them in ritual practices and ritual witchcraft magic, so to speak. The belief is that when the body parts are used in potions made by witch doctors, one can win elections, one can become lucky in marriage or in love or get promotion at work. Normally, I don't say these things to audiences that have little exposure to education, but I know in this room the collective academic knowledge is quite high, so there is no risk of propagating these misbeliefs and causing more attacks to happen. Since the position was created, I took the opportunity to also find out what was happening in other countries concerning persons with albinism. While doing that, I found out that the Pacific region has one of the highest rates of albinism. It's 1 in 700. This might sound low to you, but if you take that in context of global numbers, it's quite high. In North America and in Europe, it's normally 1 in 17,000. In Sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 15,000, with pockets of communities having 1 in 1,000. In some communities, indigenous communities, in South America and North America, the numbers are about 1 in 70 to 1 in 125. So Fiji and the Pacific region are somewhere in between, but more on the high side, with numbers going from 1 in 669 to 1 in 700. Whenever I speak to a lot of Fijians, nearly all have seen or know or are related to a person with albinism. So I decided maybe it was time to see what's going on and to see how we can help if there are any issues. And if there are no issues, then we can learn for other regions. Thankfully, the government of Fiji was appreciative of this fact. And I really wish to, at this moment, extend a huge thank you to the Attorney General and above all to the Prime Minister, to all the staff of the Geneva office of Fiji for making this happen. It's been a very fruitful mission. Just very quickly, since this is an opportunity to give some background, what is albinism? It's a condition that's just genetic. Both parents have to carry the gene for a child to be born with the condition. When both parents carry the gene, there's a 25% chance on each pregnancy that the child will have albinism. In my case, I was 1 out of 6 children with albinism. Nobody else had the condition. So as you can see, it's purely genetic and it's a kind of lottery, so to speak. However, this leads to several implications. When you have albinism, your skin color changes and you really stand out in your community. Both my parents are Black Africans. My entire family are Black Africans. It also impacts vision, and this is why we're on the disability panel. Most people with albinism have vision impairment, but it varies in each person. From person to person, it's not the same, but nonetheless, there is an impairment there. There are also issues with skin cancer vulnerabilities. If you stay in the sun long enough without the right protection, you will get skin cancer. In countries that have been counting, only 2% of people with albinism live beyond age 40. Most of them die before age 40 because of skin cancer, which is utterly preventable. These are mostly people with albinism in tropical countries, such as Fiji, who have no protection. I have no data on such numbers in Fiji. Nobody has been monitoring, nobody has been counting, but I'm really glad and looking forward to the opportunities to prevent such maladies. In this context, my presentation, which will not be too long, is to bring to your awareness that even though this section is called See the Able and not the Label, I want to bring a proposition to you to consider an exception to the rule. You're all lawyers and you know the generalities and there's always an exception. Unfortunately, you have to hear the exception first, but this is the way it is. The exception to seeing the label and not the able is a situation that really applies to people with albinism, because in Fiji for many years, there has been an awareness that or presumption, I should say, that these people are just like anyone else. They're okay. Nothing is wrong with them. So therefore, they have no impairment. They have no disability. So in this case, people have been seeing the able and not the label. So I would like to propose to you this exception, which I believe will apply not only in this case of people with albinism, but in other cases. Before I go into more details as to why you have to take this exceptional approach, I would like to give you an overview of the rights that apply in the case of people with albinism. So first of all, there are disability rights, and this is very important. I will explain briefly. There are also rights applying to color. Recently, the UN Committee on the Rights of on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination considered albinism in context of the review of South Africa and said that these people are actually facing racial discrimination based on their appearance. So it's really interesting, legally speaking, to see how color can be disconnected from race. And even in your constitution, I believe these are separate grounds, and same thing in the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So there is also this legal framework that applies to these people, discrimination based on color. There's also health rights with skin cancer prevention. In the end, if you're going to analyze these people as a people with disabilities and then as people facing racial discrimination and then health rights like everyone else, it's inevitable that we use an intersectional approach as best as possible to assess degrees of harm and assess degrees of damage where possible, of course. This exception to the rule, to see the label and not the able, will apply where some of these factors are found, such as where the able is more visible, as in people with albinism. Also, where there has been a history of presumption of sameness. Also, where there has been historical neglect of the issue. And also where there's been misunderstanding. There hasn't been public discourse on the issue, and rather presumptions have reigned. Now, some very few but key reasons for having exceptions such as these. First is the idea that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was a revolution. It has taken us from the medical approach to disability to a more flexible and inclusive approach. Normally people see me and say, but you don't have a disability. It's true, and before the convention, this would have been more true. But it's true only in light of this presumption that disability is only a few types of obvious impairment. What the convention did was take away disability from this structured approach of blind, wheelchair user, hearing impaired. Those are the traditional hegemonic approaches to disability. The CRPD, the convention, moved us from that into a new formula. This formula could take care of you tomorrow if you have an impairment and there are no accommodations for your impairment in society. So the formula is simply this: impairment that is long-lasting plus barriers in society equals disability. So disability has shifted from the body of the person with the impairment to society, to government, who now has the responsibility to remove barriers so that disability will fade away. This is the new approach to disability. And in light of this new approach, people with albinism, even though we don't have the traditional disabilities, have an impairment that is long-lasting, have faced barriers in society, and those barriers can be structural, they can be attitudinal, and in the end, the result is disability. There's also a principle in the Convention on reasonable accommodation, and reasonable accommodation is giving someone who has a long-lasting impairment those things they need to mitigate or reduce the barriers they're facing in life. It's very custom-made and it's different from accessibility. Many times we think disabled access, which is great, but that's just the beginning, and to see that alone is a reductionist approach. It's both access and reasonable accommodation. Access tends to be more general. Access such as ramps, structural changes like that are more public-oriented. Then reasonable accommodation is more customized. And do not be afraid. I tell the government in this room, many of you who I have met, thank you for your discourse and your openness. I have said repeatedly that these things are not costly. I understand Fiji is a developing country. I'm from a developing country. But some of these things can be met with very basic approaches. And I'll give examples before I conclude, using the case of people with albinism. Here are some ways in which reasonable accommodation can be given to people with albinism. First is we have to find data before we actually start to work. Well, we can work without data, but it's necessary if we're going to have long-lasting policies, particularly now that you have a national law on disability sitting at Parliament. Data is key. The last census in this country didn't have an indicator on albinism, and this is why we have to find other ways to get this data. There was only traditional disabilities on that list, which is also what we find being used internationally. I'm working hard to make an intervention to have an indicator on albinism, so we can not only count them, we can also provide the health needs such as skin cancer preventions. So this brings me to skin cancer. Reasonable accommodation can come through the prevention of skin cancer. Sunscreen lotion is key. This is what has prevented me from having skin cancer. But here, it's so expensive, most people cannot afford it. I've been talking to government about making sunscreen in Fiji. It doesn't cost that much. I believe we're going to achieve this together. I'm not going to come here, give you recommendations, and take off. I hope to work with the government to have sunscreen made here and maybe supplying tourists so that you can have income to generate and build a social enterprise around this idea and even hire people with albinism while giving them reasonable accommodation. We also need visual devices. People with albinism don't see very far. They don't see details unless they're very close. That's the vision impairment that tends to come with albinism. And they need some gadgets for that. The main gadgets used were not in this country. I did not find them at all. So I really look forward to that changing so that reasonable accommodation can be stepped up. Finally, I would like to emphasize the need to raise awareness. I think it's crucial that people understand the CRPD, since this convention was just ratified by Fiji. It is crucial they understand by example through people with albinism that the idea of disability has been transformed, that they understand that sometimes they look the same doesn't mean they're the same. And sometimes we need to see the label and not necessarily the able, even though I will caution you, and I'm sure you know that a balanced approach is necessary so that too much labeling doesn't once again lead to discrimination. I thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to a conversation afterwards. Thank you.